Hello, this is Dr. Anthony Delmond. We've been discussing communication. In particular, we've been dealing with nonverbal communication. At this point, we've spoken about the first few, but we're going to move on and start talking about facial expressions, proxemics, and paralanguage. Much like hand gestures and body movement, facial expressions can sometimes be hard to decipher. Some easy ones. Obviously, smiling is usually a positive signal, as long as it's true engagement. People generally react to a smile by smiling, so it's self-reinforcing, kind of a virtuous cycle. Frowns usually a negative signal. Furrowed brows or squinting eyes sometimes mean confusion or anxiety, not always, but usually. Raised eyebrows might mean you have a question or you're concerned about something. If someone's blinking a lot, sometimes it can mean that they are distressed about something. It might not. It could just mean that their eyes are dry, but a lot of times it indicates that they're distressed. Dilated pupils typically indicate interest or mental arousal. And another sign of tension might be lip biting, pursed lips, or covering the mouth with a hand. There are some others, obviously, but we can't go through them all here. Let's move on to proxemics. This is the distance between two people when they're discussing something. So in our example, we're talking about a buyer and seller. There are 4 spatial zones around a person receiving a message, and they're defined by distance. So we have the intimate space, which is very, very close. Personal space, which is a little further out. Social space, which is much further out. And then public space, which is the furthest out. We'll go through each of these. Public space is usually between 12 and 25 feet from the receiver. When you go beyond 25 feet, you're typically not engaged in communication with a receiver. It's difficult to create a very personalized atmosphere across public space because you're not able to engage directly with the person you're dealing with. You'd have to yell at 12 feet, or you have to speak at least very loudly. Large presentations and lectures, areas where you're going to have impersonal communication, is perfect for public space. Social space, between 6 and 12 feet from the receiver. Still difficult to make those personal connections across a social space. I've got some different distances listed in this picture, but it's just an illustration. Mid-sized sales presentations where you're giving a conversation to numerous buyers might fit well in the social space. If you need some kind of semi-personal communication where you're going to get some direct feedback, like you're going to get perhaps verbal feedback, but you don't need to read their faces, that's okay. For social space is okay for that. Personal space is between 2 and 6 feet from the receiver. That's the best place to do normal person-to-person communication. So it's very appropriate to a sales call. One-on-one sales presentations are gonna mostly fall into social space. A lot of times you'll be sitting, but you don't typically sit closer than 2 feet from someone. And lastly, the intimate space. This is going to be too close for a comfortable sales presentation. You're going to make the receiver feel very uncomfortable. They're going to feel like you're imposing upon their personal space. So the intimate space is where you're too close. A space invasion is not when you have aliens coming down from the sky. In proxemics, it's when a salesperson enters a prospect's intimate space when they're not welcome. And lastly, we're going to talk about paralanguage. This is all the stuff that accompanies your message vocally. It includes things like intonation, which is the rise and fall of your voice as you're speaking. You can definitely manipulate your intonation to change the meaning behind what you're saying. The speed of your speech. When we're nervous, we tend to speak much faster in general, and people can tell how you feel based on the speed of your words. Your volume, whether or not you're speaking very loud or very quietly. The pitch, which is the highness or lowness of your particular speech or your particular voice. Hesitations. This is going to be where you collect your thoughts or change direction in speech. This is not the same thing, though, as little verbal hesitations. This is just where you're pausing to reframe what you're saying. There's also intermittent noises. Those are the things we add to speech in between to fill the space, and a lot of times people find these to be distracting. They definitely make it seem like you don't know what you're talking about quite as much. If you have a lot of ums and so's and ahas, you're going to run the risk of people not taking you as seriously. Some of your paralanguage is going to be unintentional. A lot of times people in their first sales presentation are going to sweat, they're going to seem very nervous, and there's going to be things that happen with your body that you can't control. And people may infer something from that even though you didn't intend them. If you're sweating, turning red, you can't help if you're feeling embarrassed. So natural human function, but people infer things from them. So a lot of times people will develop their own sort of alternative personas to present to customers so that they are separated from the typical paralanguage that they would present. So you might be able to avoid some of those physiological elements if you're able to sidestep your traditional standard personality. That sounds like a lesson from psychology, but sales is psychology, at least to some degree. The last thing we want to talk about are barriers to communication. Now, these are anything that can stop a message from being sent from the sender to the receiver. There are some seller-side communication barriers, and there are some buyer-side communication barriers. We're going to talk about each in turn here. One of the major seller-side communication barriers is a poorly constructed message or a poorly encoded message. It's going to be very hard for a receiver to understand a message if it's poorly set up. So bad preparation can definitely lead to communication barriers. If you limit your interaction with buyers, if you don't speak with buyers very much, if you don't have a lot of engagement back and forth, there's going to be some barrier there. If you don't listen to what the buyer is telling you, if you are just hearing and not listening, the buyer's not going to feel that you're paying attention to them, and they're not going to react the way that you would hope. Poor customization or poor adaptation. If you're not reacting to what the customer is telling you, you're going to create your own barriers to communication. If you have a bad attitude, again, customers pick up on this and they're not going to engage with you. And confusing verbal signaling and nonverbal signaling. If you give mixed messages, we talked about that in poorly constructed messages, but if you give nonverbal signaling, that doesn't make sense. For example, if you consistently have a furrowed brow like you're concerned, they're not going to understand how they're supposed to react to what you're saying. So that's always going to create some sort of communication barrier. On the opposite side, there are some communication barriers involving the buyer directly. Those are inattention. This is just where the buyer's not engaged with what's going on, but it's not distraction. Distraction is something different. Distraction is when there is something competing for the interest of your buyer. If somebody's got a cell phone out, obviously they're not paying attention. If they have a piece of paper in front of them, this is why you don't want to hand your buyer a pamphlet up front, because they're going to be reading the pamphlet and distracted instead of paying attention to your direct personal message. If they have a bad or negative attitude, just like if the seller does, this is going to create new barriers. And again, confusing or mismatched nonverbal signaling. If you can't read your buyer, it's going to lead to poor outcomes. It's going to lead to bad communication. But miscommunication can provide an opportunity to step back and clarify certain parts of the message that weren't properly transmitted, as long as the seller can recognize in real time that there are communication barriers at hand. All right, that's it for this lecture. Make sure you look at the keywords, go through everything before you do the module assignment and eventually the exam.